Okay, in this video we're going to be talking through the 30-15 intermittent fitness test. This is a test for aerobic fitness and is a very reliable measure of that. And so what we're going to be running through is what the test is, some of the pros and cons, how you calculate the running prescriptions from it, and then to give you some examples of different types of running sessions that you can do from this test. So first of all, it's a shuttle-based intermittent running test. In other words, it's not continuous. You perform a shuttle-based run for 30 seconds. So on the kind of image you can see on the screen there, you've got line A on the left, line B in the middle, and line C. So athletes start at line A, and the beep starts, and you're going to start running for 30 seconds. On an intermittent sort of scheme, if you like, a beep goes, and whenever the beep goes, you need to have reached the next line. So if an athlete's running along, reaches line B, and the beep sounds, then they're fine. If they miss that 3 times in a row, then they are out of the test. One slight kind of subtlety with the test, I suppose. There are some safety areas across A, B, and C. So if you're within the safety zone when the beep goes, you're fine as long as you do eventually reach the line properly. So, as long as you're inside that safety zone, the beep goes, as long as you then also hit the line after that and catch up, you're fine. So athletes start at 8 kilometers per hour, and then every 45 seconds, so 30 seconds of work, 15 seconds recovery, the speed then goes up by half a kilometer per hour, and the final level completed is the athlete's what's known as VIFT score, so velocity in the intermittent fitness test score, and this is scored in kilometers per hour. So for example, if an athlete completes level 20, which would be running speed of 20 kilometers per hour, and they complete every single beep as the test goes on, and they don't miss any, but then they can't complete level 20.5, their final score is 20 kilometers per hour. This is important because one of the cons I'll be speaking about is the fact that it's actually quite difficult to jump a whole level up. It actually requires, a full 30 seconds more of running before you can achieve a level up. So we'll look at kind of some of the subtleties and challenges potentially of running the test in a sort of second. So one key point with this is that it isn't maximal aerobic speed. Maximal aerobic speed is a little different because maximal aerobic speed is the lowest speed at which VO2 max occurs, whereas the VIFT score, because of its intermittent nature, also takes into account anaerobic qualities as well. So it's not purely a measure of aerobic fitness. It's actually a hybrid kind of score of a number of different things. This is both a positive and a potential drawback of the test, because if you are purely prescribing from it, sometimes there are sort of subtleties in terms of how you program from that may be a limiting factor. So what it is a composite velocity. This is what we would refer to as a composite velocity, because it takes into account anaerobic capabilities and change of direction ability, all of which contribute to field-based sports performance. Whereas if you think about a mass test, which might be something like a continual 16 pitch lengths run or 1500 meter run or 5-minute run, as long as it's within that 5 to 7 minute window, you're not really assessing anaerobic at all ability, apart from that kind of perhaps sprint towards the end. But because of the duration of the test, there's no way that you can perform that anaerobically. Whereas the 30-15, because it is performed in an intermittent fashion, actually the speed which you achieve is much higher than your maximum aerobic speed, which is really positive, because it also, what we'll look at in just a second, is that it allows for a slightly more homogeneous individual physiological response, which I'll dial into in just a second. But the take home from that is that the actual score you get is a combination of a number of different factors, which again is a positive because it gives you lots of information. The drawback potentially is that you don't necessarily know what has caused the score to be achieved, whether it was a limitation in aerobic capability, a limitation in maximal running speed, a limitation in acceleration, a limitation in their change of direction ability. So it could actually be a number of different things. And so ideally, if you're going to do this test, you'd also do a couple of others to kind of ascertain which specific component actually is the limiting factor. Okay, in terms of individual responses, one of the really big positives of it is this individual response, and this is all the amazing work from Martin Bichet that he's been doing over the last sort of 20 years in this test. As you can see on the right-hand side there, this shows 3 different handball athletes performing on the top graph there. 15 on, 15 on type interval session, very typical, using what is effectively a maximum aerobic speed test. And you can see there that if you're only using maximum aerobic speed, the heart rate responses across those different intervals are actually quite broadly different. It's actually a 10% coefficient variation, which means, as you can see quite clearly on the graph there, quite a bit of a spread in terms of their heart rate responses. Whereas using a 30-15 prescription, because it accounts for anaerobic capabilities as well, there's actually only a 3% coefficient variation, and so the individual responses to the 15 on 15 off session are a lot more tightly grouped, which is good, because otherwise we aren't necessarily accounting for athletes' anaerobic capabilities. We're only looking at aerobic if we use a maximum aerobic speed score. So the positive is it takes into consideration an athlete's anaerobic capabilities as well. So some pros and cons. The real pros of the test is that you kind of get a much more consistent physiological response, as we've already outlined there. So rather than having wildly different kind of heart rate responses to different training sessions, you're going to get a really nice consistent physiological response across a group of different athletes. And so everyone's getting a relatively difficult session. So, whereas if you're running at 110% of maximum aerobic speed, well, someone might be quicker than someone else, even if their mass scores are the same. And so you get this kind of big variation. Whereas prescribing from 30-15, it kind of accounts for that, and therefore everyone's physiological response, is exactly the same, or relatively the same. You can prescribe directly from it, because once you've got the test score, you can then prescribe intervals straight from it. And it's also related to repeat sprintability, which is obviously a core component of team-based performance. Things like hockey, football, you need to have that repeat sprintability component, and so it is related to that. There's a lot of research showing that athletes with a higher 30-15 score have also performed better in the repeat sprintability test as well. Some of the cons, it's a little bit difficult to administer with large groups because of the nature of it. It requires quite a lot of sort of logistical setup and that kind of thing. And certainly, unless you're going to record the test, it's a little bit difficult to make sure that it's really accurate in terms of the turns, if people are hitting the line or not. And so you do need quite a lot of eyes on the test if you're using this with large groups. It doesn't provide mass specifically or maximal sprint speed. Whereas if you're taking the approach of doing a mass time trial and a flying 10-meter sprint, for example, that would give you those two scores. So it gives you this kind of hybrid composite velocity in the middle of these two scores. So it accounts for it, but it doesn't necessarily provide it. And then finally, the levels are large from a motivational perspective. Imagine the difference between a maximum aerobic speed test like a 16 pitch lengths, where you could, in theory, improve by 5 seconds, which would be a nice motivational boost. Whereas to level up in the 30-15 to, say, go from 19.5 to 20, you're going to have to perform up to 30 seconds more work, which actually is a relatively large jump. And so from a psychological perspective, in terms of giving goals and that kind of thing to athletes to work towards, it can, in the early stages, you're naturally going to progress quite quickly. But as you start to kind of plateau in terms of that sort of progress, a 30-second jump forward is actually a relatively large jump and can be quite challenging for athletes. Okay, when it comes then to sort of calculating from this, and then in terms of how the sessions might look, step one is to basically convert the kilometers per hour, which you're going to get, because your score, the VIFT score, is always in kilometers per hour. You want to convert that into meters per second. And very simply, you take the kilometers and divide by 3.61 to give you meters. So, for example, 20 divided by 3.61 would give you 5.54 meters per second. So if someone scored 20 kilometers per hour in the 30-15 test, this would equate to 5.54 meters per second. Then step 2, you take that score and multiply it by the running intensity you want to work out, and then multiply that by the interval duration you're going to run for, and that is therefore your prescribed distance. So an athlete who scores 20 kilometers per hour, which is 5.54 meters per second, is going to be running at 90% of their VIFT score for 10 seconds. So 5.54 times by 90% times by 10 seconds gives the athlete a 50 meter target in that 10-second period. So if an athlete wants to do a 10-second on, 10-second off session, and their score is 20 kilometers per hour in 30:15, that is the calculation for them. And then finally, there's 2 different sort of example sessions here. There are a number of different variations on this, but these are kind of a couple of classical ones that you can complete off of the 30:15. On the left-hand side here, we've got a short interval session, which is the exact one I've just explained. 10 seconds on, 10 seconds off at 90% of the VIFT score. So, for example, if the athlete's 20 kilometer per hour score there from a 30:15 is taken into account, they would have a 50 meter target. And the volumes and recoveries around this sort of sessions can look something like 2 sets of 10 to 15 reps with 6-minute recovery per set. Again, these are prescriptions based off of Martin Boucher's work. The volume at which you pick, 10 to 15 is quite a big range there clearly, so you probably kind of err on the side of lower with younger athletes or less experienced athletes, and then you build the volume over time. And then on the right hand side we've got long intervals, and these are much more aerobic, what we call central adaptation focus, so trying to improve kind of central factors like cardiac output and oxygen delivery. This is a very typical session, so 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off. So you're going to run for 3 minutes and rest for 3 minutes. The running speed is 80% of your VIFT score, and you're going to complete 5 to 6 sets in total. And so, for example, a 798 meter distance target, you'd probably round this to 800 just to give it a nice sort of clean number to aim for. If the athlete's score was 20 kilometers per hour. Okay, again, using exactly the same math. So you'd take 20 divided by 3.61. That gives you the meters per second score. You're then going to times that by 180 seconds because that's how long you're going to want to work for. And then you're going to times it by 80% because that's the intensity you want to work for. And that's going to give you your 798 distance target. So I hope this has been useful, a sort of useful summary of the 30:15 test. As I say, the test is very useful for many ways, but it also provides a couple of sort of drawbacks in some instances. If you've got the capability to do it, it is recognised as the sort of gold standard for aerobic fitness assessment. But for a lot of clubs or athletes who are perhaps operating by themselves, they don't really have the resource to do it. The logistics are obviously a little bit fiddly, and sometimes you actually benefit from doing it in a group. So that's why possibly sometimes doing a sort of 16 pitch lengths time trial and a flying 10 meter sprint are often a little bit more straightforward in some ways when you're trying to get similar amount of information to prescribe from. So I hope this has been helpful. The reference is there for you to have a quick look through. And if you've got any questions off the back of this, just drop me a message.